Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Respectively, good morning to our friends on the other side of the pond. My name is Daniel Schwammetal. I am the director of the American Jewish Committee's EU office in Brussels, the AJC Transatlantic Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this exclusive briefing for lawmakers and diplomats co-organized with the Israeli mission to the EU and NATO. This exclusive meeting is part of the Transatlantic Friends of Israel network we at AJC helped launch in 2019. It is the first ever cross-party inter-parliamentary group of its kind and currently counts over 100 lawmakers from 26 countries united in the conviction that the Jewish state is an integral part of the vital transatlantic security, economic, and political architecture. And it is particularly the security partnership we want to explore today. The West faces a multitude of threats: hybrid warfare, terrorism, including the state-sponsored variety, and nuclear proliferation, to name just a few. In all of these areas, Israel is a vital ally, given its first-class security services, cutting-edge high-tech sector, and thriving knowledge-based economy. Moreover, the Jewish state is in many ways Europe's and America's first line of defense in a rather critical but volatile region. I'm particularly pleased to see so many new lawmakers here today, and we would of course be delighted if you considered also joining our growing network. In this context, it might interest you that we have just launched a new campaign urging EU member states and other fellow democracies to end Israel's discrimination at the UN, which not only damages Israel, but also undermines the UN itself. After this event, we will email you this declaration, which we hope you will be able to support. A few housekeeping words. We very much welcome active participation by lawmakers and diplomats. If you would like to make an intervention, please use the chat function here in Zoom to notify us that you would like to make an intervention. Today's discussion will be recorded, but in order to respect your privacy, only the panelists and those participants choosing to take the floor will be visible in the video. And now I have the honor to give the floor to our two co-hosts, Hungarian lawmaker Attila Mesterházy, Vice President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and James Bezan, Vice Chair of the Canadian House of Commons National Defense Standing Committee. Perhaps we'll go with Europe first. Mr. Mesterházy, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be involved in this discussion. So, dear participants, as I said, it's an honor for me to participate in this dialogue, to get together with the friends of Transatlantic Friends of Israel. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly, NATO-PA in short, is institutionally separate from NATO. In my remarks, I will therefore focus on the very good cooperation between the NATO-PA and the Knesset, as well as on how the NATO-PA views the changing dynamics in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. As you may know, the NATO-PA provides a unique forum for parliamentarians from North America and Europe to discuss and influence decisions on alliance security. Through our work and activities, we facilitate parliamentary awareness and understanding of security challenges and support national parliamentary oversight over defense and security. We also serve as an essential link between NATO and the national parliaments. We have a broad and deep network of partners outside the NATO alliance. Israel, one of our 4 Mediterranean associates, is a very strong partner. The Knesset delegation under the able leadership of Zvi Hauser plays an active role in the Assembly. NATO-PA delegations have visited Israel almost every other year in the past decade. A key instrument for our partnership is the Mediterranean and the Middle East Special Group, or sort of equivalent to NATO's Mediterranean Dialogue. This group will actually meet tomorrow to take stock of the past 10 years since the Arab uprising. To my mind, the strength of our cooperation rests on the fact that the Transatlantic Alliance and Israel share a range of common goals and interests, for example, preserving the international rules-based order, fostering respect for democracy and human rights as a universal value, and creating a stable and prosperous MENA region in which Israel is a recognized and respected actor. In today's complex security environment, members of the NATO PA and the Knesset can learn from each other and work together to address challenges that none of them can deal with on their own. COVID-19 is a case in point. Many of our countries are looking to Israel for inspiration and best practices on resilience and vaccination. But the region is fraught with many more challenges which impact both Israel's and our security. The persistent terrorist threat, Iran's nuclear ambition and destabilizing role in the region, the devastating consequences of continued chaos in Syria and Yemen, or ongoing instability in Libya. These issues were at the heart of the reports which my Turkish colleagues Ahmet Yildiz and Faik Ostrak presented to our assembly last year, and of several of our meetings. And 3 of our committees will examine reports on some of these issues this year again. At the same time, our assembly has recognized that the string of reconciliation between several Gulf monarchies and Israel is highly consequential and creates significant opportunities for the region. This is why, in our contribution to the important reflection process on NATO 2030, the Assembly has called on the Alliance to maintain a strong focus on developments in the southern neighborhood and strengthen its cooperation with key partners in this region. I'm convinced that the NATO 2030 process and the upcoming revision of NATO's strategic concept offer important and timely opportunities to take a fresh look at NATO's cooperation with the region. I look forward to hearing from our Israeli friends what their priorities would be for this reflection. Dear friends, to conclude, the partnership between NATO and Israel and the NATO PA and the Knesset are valuable because they enable us to exchange ideas and best practices on the challenges we have in common, to promote our shared democratic values, and to advance the understanding between our countries and our people. Thank you very much, and I'm really looking for the discussion and the dialogue. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mesterházy, for your interesting remarks. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. If you're in North America, and if you're in Europe, I hope you're having a great afternoon and evening. So just want to thank the AJC for having me co-host this event today. And I would also just say that for those of you that are Irish, or those of us that wish we were, happy St. Patrick's Day. I'm wearing my green in celebration here in Canada. So I hope you're tipping a pint if you're in Europe right now, or Israel for that matter, although the bars haven't opened here in North America yet. So we'll have a good time later, despite COVID. As someone who is a strong believer in NATO and also an advocate for Israel, I think today's discussion is just so relevant for what we're facing as allies, as friends, and as neighbors. And, as Attila just mentioned, you talk about the longstanding alliance between NATO and Israel, and you talk about the role that they've played in the Mediterranean dialogue, and how that goal of cooperation on the security-related issues in the European neighborhood has helped enhance peace and prosperity within the region. Now, Israel has constantly contributed to our collective security through intelligence sharing, practically in all areas when you look at terrorism threats that continue to preoccupy our minds as NATO members. If NATO expanded to include Israel, Israel would be at the top of the GDP metrics that we use in measuring defense spending at 5.3%. That's even higher than the United States. I'm often asked as a politician why I support Israel, and I believe as a Canadian, it's in our strategic interest to support Israel. But as well, I always believe in standing up for democracy, for pluralism and human rights, which all are encompassed right in Israel itself, in a region that all too often turns it back on democracy, human rights, and on pluralism. I currently serve as pointed out as Vice Chair of our Standing Committee on National Defense in Parliament, but I'm also the Shadow Minister for the official opposition. And previously, I served as the Parliamentary Secretary to National Defense in the Stephen Harper government. And I was proud when I was a member of the Harper government that we not only recognized Israel's strategic importance to Canada, but we constantly pushed back in different multilateral forums, including the UN, on those one-sided resolutions that keep coming forward every year against Israel. And I can guarantee you that as a Canadian, as a parliamentarian, I will continue to push that we take the principled stand and stand with Israel when these types of resolutions come forward. Now, Israel is part of the wider family of Western democratic nations, and it's in NATO's interest and Canada's interest to enhance security cooperation with Israel because it stands on the front lines of the threats that we all face, whether it's our shared values, whether it's our collective security. With the rise of ISIS, the threat of nuclear Iran, and the instability in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, as well as many other countries, it all points to the need to enhance the NATO relationship with Israel. Israeli intelligence sharing, cybersecurity, kinetic interventions contribute to peace and security well beyond its own borders. Israel has foiled plots from terrorist groups in recent years in Turkey and France and London, among many other places, and provides a bulwark against Iranian-backed militants and terrorists that are destabilizing the Middle East. Israel continues to sign peace treaties with its neighbors in both Northern Africa and the Middle East. And, it's a clear sign that Israel is committed to peace, security, and trying to limit Iran's influence in the region. Now, normalizing relationship with its neighborhood also enhances the prospect of deepening ties between NATO and Israel itself. So Israel holds, many cutting-edge technologies in the military sphere, and much of its military equipment is already interoperable with us as NATO allies. And we should be taking even more advantage and more opportunities to share military technologies and deepen our economic ties. Now, in Canada, we're keen on enhancing, especially as conservatives, on enhancing the bilateral relationship between Canada and Israel on defense and security. We see broad opportunities to engage with Israel on defense materials, military procurement, and training with our forces. So Canada's contribution to the NATO operation in Iraq through Operation Impact underscores the importance of the region in which Israel sits to the collective security of Europe and North America. Canada led that mission until November 2020, when Canadian Major General Kerrigan handed the reins over to Denmark. When European cities found themselves subject to terrorist attack by ISIS and its affiliates, as well as the pressures of mass migration from war-torn Syria, it serves as a reminder that the security threats intrinsic to Israel since its restoration as a nation are also our problems today and tomorrow, unless we intensify regional cooperation. While some ink has been spilled on the question of Israel joining NATO, we should be looking at ways to enhance Israel's status within NATO. Closer relationships with Israel and intelligence sharing, joint military exercises, and regional cooperation are not just possible, they are necessary. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion today.
Thank you so much, James. And now I have the great pleasure to hand it over to my dear colleague, Avital Leibovich, Director of our Jerusalem office.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you to our co-host. It's wonderful to be with you here today. It's the afternoon now in Tel Aviv time, and it's a great pleasure to be moderating such an important panel. With us today, we have three distinguished guests. With your permission, dear guests, I will read your titles and your profession, and then I'll refer to you by the first name, so we don't use the long title. So first and foremost, we have the Ambassador of Israel to the EU and NATO, Mr. Leshno-Yaar. And then we have Colonel Nir Omer. He's the military representative to NATO and to the EU. He's also the defense attaché to the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And finally, we have Dr. Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe and NATO's former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. So we have three angles, three great speakers. Let's begin. After the conversation, we'll give you the opportunity, of course, to ask additional questions. So Israel and NATO share, I would say, a special relationship, and Attila and James, you refer to it as allies and friends, you use those terms. On the one hand, it's still very far from maximizing its potential, but on the other hand, it is strengthening due to the regional changes. My opening question has to do with this relationship. Why does NATO need Israel and vice versa? Why does Israel need NATO? Roni, I'm turning the question first to you. Just you need to unmute, please.
Okay.
There you
It's
go.
okay now?
Yep.
Great. So I also have some green spots on my tie to show solidarity with our Irish friends and friends with Irish family background. Avital, Daniel, thank you for hosting us today. The Transatlantic Institute is doing a great job in Brussels, and we appreciate the partnership with you. And I'm also happy to share this panel with Jamie and my colleague, Colonel Nir Omer. You know, Israel upgraded its status in NATO 5 years ago. It happened when I just arrived to Brussels. I give full credit to the Israeli ambassadors that served here before me, that prepared the groundwork for this fantastic upgrade. I presented credentials to the Secretary General. We opened an office in NATO, and we have an IPCP with NATO that recently has been extended with the support of all allies. And in the 5 years that I'm here, there is a really impressive list of Israel-NATO activities, both in Brussels, in Israel, and in many of the allied countries. You see the list, you see where we come from, where NATO comes from, and why it is so important for both sides, because it includes a variety of issues, not all of them military or defense related. Most of them are military or defense related. And we have a great ambition to expand this cooperation in the next several years. I will say, because the two that preceded me referred to it, that although Israel is not discussing currently official membership in NATO, becoming an ally, we would like to be as close as possible to NATO, and we are inching forward in that direction. To your question, I will say that what is important from my perspective for Israel, and we will work on it in the next few years. So first, there are the regional challenges, which are important both for Israel and for NATO, and it relates to states. I would say rogue states in the region, which are a challenge for NATO and for Israel. There is no need to detail here. And what is even more alarming is the challenge of sub-state actors. In other words, terrorist organizations. And it's a challenge which is military, as well as ethical and legal and humanitarian in nature. And Israel is, unfortunately, Israel is excellently positioned to deal with such challenges because we are surrounded by both rogue states and sub-state actors. So we are first in line to respond to those terrorist groups and to deal both on the ground and in the international arena with the challenges, and I mentioned legal and ethical challenges that those actors present to Israel. So that's the number one challenge that we have in common with NATO. The second one, I will say, it's the issues which comes under the title scientific, technological innovation in nature. And here already there is excellent cooperation between Israel and NATO that we wish to expand, certainly under Agenda 2030, and we already started discussing this with NATO. And last but not least, and this is an extremely important point for me, for us, and we can elaborate later, is regional cooperation under the umbrella of NATO, meaning to bring to the table allies, Arab countries, and the state of Israel to discuss regional challenges, again, not only from the political or defense or military perspective, but other perspectives as well. And I think that the Abraham Accords, the process of normalization between Israel and Arab countries, provide us with beautiful and very useful platform to expand and deepen that trilateral cooperation. I'll stop here. Happy to expand later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ronnie. Jamie, from your perspective, from the NATO perspective, what can you add on what Ronnie said? Why does NATO need Israel? Because Ronnie mentioned your mutual challenges. Based on your experience, how do you see this cooperation?
Well, Avital, great to see you again. Daniel, thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to be back, to echo Joe Biden. Normally, when a very good ambassador speaks, and Ronnie certainly is a top-class ambassador, there isn't very much to add. I get the impression that he sort of hacked into my brain this morning and pulled out all of my top speaking points. But no, I mean, I dealt a lot with Israel when I was at NATO until the end of 2018. And at the time, I was dealing a lot with counter-terrorism issues. And, I had to sort of put on demonstrations of non-lethal weapons. I had to look very closely at how we dealt in Afghanistan with the issue of improvised explosive devices. I had to look at how we could deal with drones flying over civilian areas. And I used to reach out to the allies and I would say, look, can you send a company along with some demonstration equipment so that I can run my trial? Can you give me some expertise? And I would tell you quite openly that the only country that never said no to me was Israel. I got a lot more support, often from Israel, than I did from many allies. And I really would like to thank Israel, because not just for that, but because I was involved in some difficult times, when we wanted to go much faster with Israel, those of us on the international staff, when we were looking at the sort of upgrade that the ambassador was referring to earlier, when we wanted to get Israel more involved in some of our exercises and maritime activities, particularly in the Mediterranean, because Israel had so much to contribute, when we wanted to open the office, and we were stuck with, the normal sort of intra-alliance politics, which you all know too well. And I say thank you, because some partners, I think, might have turned their backs on NATO, thinking, well, we're offering them more than they're offering us. Is it really worthwhile? Particularly a country, as the ambassador said, that is not seeking NATO membership. And to its credit, and I know from my contacts in NATO, from the old colleagues, that it's very much the same. Israel has sort of never given up on NATO, despite some of those political frustrations. For example, in the current partnership program, sticking with the status quo, not going forward. It's been a very dependable, very reliable country. So that's the first point I would like to say. The second point, which I think is important, is of course, and this point's been made already, where NATO is going in the future is where Israel has already been, and we would be foolhardy to reinvent the wheel painfully and make all of the mistakes again. And so learning from Israel is important. And I'm really pleased that this has developed, because frankly, when I started out and I paid my first visits as a NATO official to Jerusalem and to Tel Aviv, we found that it was easy to work on areas like missile defense, less easy, to be frank with you, on cyber. And I can understand it's of course, a much more discrete area for many of us. But over the years, a lot of those areas where there were sensitivities on both sides have opened up, and that's for the greater good. Now, we're facing an agenda today, and again, a lot of these points have been made, where NATO is embracing new areas, space, which has recently been declared as the fifth domain of military operations. We've got, obviously, the whole fake news information space. And my God, if there's one country that's been used to a lot of fake news and disinformation and hostile propaganda and learned to deal with it, is Israel. I mean, Israel has cottoned on to the notion of the information space in modern conflicts, first and foremost. The resilience thing has been mentioned. And, I was struck a couple of years ago in Brussels when we had a terrorist attack here. And I'm not pointing any fingers here. It was a bit of a novel experience for Belgium. But I'm sure the ambassador remembers trying to fly into Brussels, that the airport was closed down for several months, the hotels were closed,
Right.
portions of the metro were closed. Whereas if this happens in Israel, tragically, and I'm the last person to obviously to ever welcome that, but you had this capacity to bounce back within a matter of hours. And I think as NATO gets very much into the notion of resilience has to be built at the level of citizens, not just at governments or international organizations, at the level of local communities, at the level of education. It needs to be in the DNA as society develops. All of that resilience and hybrid agenda, which you referred to, I think is opening up as well. Climate change is another thing. You know, the Secretary General of NATO is very keen on pushing the notion of a role in NATO in climate change. And again, your own experience of greening the Israeli defense forces, your own ability to deal with climate change challenges in terms of water and so on. I think there's an interesting avenue. And of course, I could talk for many hours about artificial intelligence and all of the disruptive technology. So, it really is a marriage made in heaven, frankly. And I agree. I mean, if somebody asked me how I would characterize it, I would say it's been good, but it should have been, given the overwhelming pressure of the common interest that bring us together, it should be much better. So what I would like to see, well, the ambassador mentioned the regional cooperation. I would like to see much more flexible formats, the Mediterranean dialogue, the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative coming close together. I mean, Israel was in the Mediterranean dialogue, but most of its relations, obviously developing since the Abraham Accords, are with the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative side. So I'd like to see those barriers breaking down. I would hope that we could have a format in the future which would bring together the participants in the Abraham Accords, for instance, maybe with Saudi Arabia and Oman, who knows? I can speak freely now that I'm only a mere think tanker as an observer, so that we could get the best out of those regional, more flexible formats. I hope the new strategic concept, which was mentioned by James a moment ago, could help to push us in that direction. The Eastern Mediterranean is becoming an increasingly important nexus. Of course, allies have their problems there, and Greece and Turkey met yesterday, but we also have Syria, we also have Russia, we also have China, we have an important energy route there. Israel is now even building a 1,000-kilometer cable. So I think the Eastern Mediterranean specific area of interest would be something that I hope we could very much look at as well as we go forward. And finally, I hope that as the Biden administration reaches out to Turkey, we can obviously have a situation where all allies take the same view as Israel, so that we can then go for those kind of upgrades that I think are in everybody's interest. So I know that it's been somewhat of an intractable issue for many of us, but I always hope that even intractable, as the Abraham Accords demonstrate, even the most intractable issues do unfreeze eventually. Thank you.
Thank you. I can relate to many of the things you said on the issue of resilience. For example, when Israel was attacked by Saddam Hussein, the first Gulf War, it realized back then that the civilians are the first one to be attacked. They are the soft belly of this country, and therefore it built a home front command which knows how to engage in a dialogue with the civilians. So that's the resilience part. And then I definitely identify with what you said, that Israel didn't give up on NATO, and Israel also didn't give up on Europe. And of course, it goes hand in hand. So thank you for that. Colonel Nir, I would now like to dive, with your permission, to some of the Israeli assets that can be and are shared with our NATO friends. One area of interest, which comes to mind, is information sharing. Another, which is a very sexy area, is cyber. Can you walk us through the different capabilities, the different assets that Israel has to offer?
Yes, of course. Thank you for your question. Good afternoon, everyone. When it comes to Israeli defense assets, we are certainly eager to share knowledge and operational expertise. You just mentioned missile defense and the Home Front Command, and this week a press release was notified that our Iron Dome missile defense system successfully completed experiments, a series of experiments to counter UAVs together with projectiles. So I think when NATO allies are just starting to discuss how to effectively counter the threat of UAVs, we can certainly share our scientific and operational knowledge to the benefit of the alliance. And I think a platform like Iron Dome is extremely flexible, and it can be used for military aspects, but also to defend the critical infrastructure of threatened states in different areas, which are in areas of interest of NATO. Another example, I think cyber was mentioned here, and I must say that to some extent, we already share information with NATO. Of course, it is a rather sensitive topic, but when it comes to cyber defense, I think there is a joint interest to share IOCs, to share information, how to mitigate campaigns which are inflicting worldwide damage to Israel and to NATO allies. I think our expertise, whereas NATO has a global footprint, our expertise in cyber is still a certain advantage when it comes to regional actors. And of course, Ambassador Leshno reminded it before, but I can address specifically Iran is known for its cyber capabilities, and this is an area in which we can certainly share information, whereas NATO can share, on the other side, information about more global campaigns. And I think we already passed that bridge, and it's certainly an area that we can further cooperate. When it comes to other areas, capabilities that help us mitigate terror or other hybrid threats are extremely developed. I can mention the war between wars as an example. So the war between wars, in which we aim to prevent our enemies from achieving capabilities that might cause an escalation in the region and cause a high-profile conflict, involves a lot of intelligence-driven and information-driven warfare. And there are a lot of capabilities that we developed how to accurately take out terror assets and military assets in dense urban environment without causing any casualties and minimizing collateral damage. And I think that's a challenge that also all NATO allies face due to the region of NATO missions. So of course, Iraq, Afghanistan, but also Africa are challenging with significant similarities.
Thank you, Nir. We'll return to those issues, by the way, later on. I'd like to return to you for a moment, Jamie, and speak to you a bit about technology. You know, the word technology often comes up with regard to Israeli expertise. Apologize for my dog's barking. I remember years ago in one of the operations the IDF had in Gaza, the soldiers used a 360-degree camera, which was called an eyeball. It's really shaped like a ball, and the soldiers rolled it to a room in order to look and have a 360-degree angle visibility to see whether that room is booby-trapped, whether a terrorist is hiding behind the door, and so on. Basically, it's a technological gadget which helps save human lives. In your previous role, dealing with security challenges, how important was it to obtain a high level of technology? And how do you evaluate Israeli capabilities in that sense?
Well, yes, thank you. It is a great question. My view of this is that it's, of course, a question of identifying quickly winning technologies, particularly those that give you, for a relatively cheap price, a good upgrade on your existing equipment and prolong its life, rather like putting the JDAM laser-guided system on the old dumb bombs, which make them much more accurate and therefore usable. So yes, I mean, those things are always useful. But I think where Israel is useful to NATO is in the ecosystem of technology, Avital, if I can put it that way. It's not just a question of, your companies like Rafael come up with a brilliant tank at a very good price, which Israel often does offer, but that you have this sort of ecosystem whereby startup companies, small and medium size enterprises, innovative technologies quickly find their way to market through these private-public partnerships. You're very good at this. A small country, I know, although the population getting larger all the time, but this is what we find trouble with in Europe, where in Europe you have some excellent sort of universities and innovation, but where most of the time the startups get bought up by somebody else, China until recently, the US, and the marketing takes place elsewhere. There is not a venture capital sort of culture like you have in Israel in terms of developing, and so we miss the bus. We have the innovation, but we can't develop the technology. And again, today it matters because, of course, when I was at NATO during the Cold War, it didn't matter so much if you were slow at doing this, because the Russians, the Soviets, were far, far worse and were never going to catch up. But of course, today, I hardly need to tell you this, we're dealing, and not just with China, but with a number of countries that are starting to learn this ecosystem and becoming more formidable competitors to us. And I'm somebody, as a historian of warfare, which is my fundamental profession, who believes that it's the sides with the technological advantages that always win. Not simply because they have the better technology. You can argue that the Germans in World War II in some cases had the better technology, but because the victors were able to exploit it and use it in the most intelligent way, faster, and bring it to bear. And so as this becomes increasingly a problem or a challenge for the NATO, developing this disruptive technology environment, picking winners, making the right investments, moving away from our old, as we used to say, heavy metal industrial companies towards the more high-tech companies where more of this stuff is being generated in the civilian area, but learning from your ecosystem rather than picking an individual technology, no matter how good your 360-degree camera in Gaza no doubt turned out to be. That's where we really need to have that dialogue. The US sort of gets it, but Europe, as we all know, is still dragging behind. On the other hand, there's now the European Defence Fund, which has started up, with PESCO. I don't know to what degree you follow these bureaucratic internecine EU issues, but there's a little bit more money on the table now for military research and technology. And as the EU is reaching out to partner countries, the US, the UK, I would also hope that the EU might have the wisdom to reach out to Israel too, for some of these joint ventures within the European Defence Fund. Thank you.
Very interesting. I'm sure our friend Nir here will follow up on that. But I want to return to you, Nir. We discussed the assets, and one of the recent challenges, as in the past decade, that Israel is facing is the whole issue of human shields and urban warfare. Additionally, there is a somewhat new term called hybrid attacks, and Ronnie, you mentioned it before. So Nir, could you walk us through these issues, and what can Israel share with NATO on these specific issues?
Yes, I think the term hybrid threats, it's a very broad term, but roughly describing it, we can describe it as threats which are not the classical threats that we were used to from past war times, cyber information warfare, but also terror activities being done from dense urban environment. And I think, unfortunately, due to our operational experience, we acquired significant knowledge and operational lessons learned and lessons identified that can be shared with all NATO allies. And as I said, are extremely relevant to many of the non-state actors, but also some of the potential adversaries that NATO faces. And when I'm saying these operations lessons learned, I also include capabilities that were developed and are certainly already being shared, but could be shared to a much more significant extent in the technological aspects, in the operational and doctrine aspects, and as well as in the areas of training and exercises. To give several examples, so you've mentioned the eyeball. The eyeball and some other relevant products came to basically two purposes. The first purpose is, of course, to mitigate threats for our infantry, but also to minimize collateral damage and to avoid casualties of innocent civilians in case that terrorists are hiding in a civilian environment, which is also the case in Iraq and Afghanistan and other areas. If I conclude, cyber terror activity, proxies of countries like Iran, which act in ways of, let's call it a guerrilla warfare, which is sometimes using urban environment to hide ammunition, capabilities, and to defend itself from all kinds of military capabilities. There are all challenges that NATO is also facing. Maybe I'll also mention, before I hand out the microphone, that the way of conducting an efficient campaign against these threats highly involves information-driven and intelligence-driven warfare, which means that you have to be able to collaborate between different partners, between different sensors, between different services to achieve an effective result in the battlefield within a matter of sometimes seconds and minutes. I think when it comes to being able to be agile and to respond quickly, the IDF has a certain expertise due to our regional threats. And I think similar threats are already challenging NATO forces worldwide. So I think this summarizes some of the examples to the question you raised. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nir. I do believe that we do have a first question comment from the audience. I'd like to call to MEP Anna Fotija, a Polish member of the European Parliament. Anna, please, the floor is yours. Only unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hello, do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks also to all speakers for a very interesting contribution. I must say that I combine in my experience of engagement with Israel, the bilateral, I'm Polish MEP, so Polish-Israeli relations, but also my experience within the European Parliament, 3 terms already, and as a member of NATO reflection group and elaborating our report on or engaged in elaborating the report on NATO 2030. Allow me to start with this last experience, and I would like to compliment the Israeli contribution, and that answers part of this question. I think that engagement with official engagement of the group of experts with Ambassador Leshno-Yaar was extremely fruitful, adding to our knowledge and possibility to swiftly contribute to this report as well. There are many areas introduced by earlier speakers, Jamie in particular, and I think that in all those areas we can benefit from experience and long-standing experience of Israel in coping with challenges and immediate threats, successfully coping with this. I think that it is also extremely important to take this double track approach, meaning that via EU and EU engagements, European scope, and via NATO, because I think that cooperation between both organization adds to synergy, although there are voices in some areas of EU trying to sound like competitory to NATO, yet it is more than obvious that cooperation between both organizations may just add to our common security. We were talking about hybrid threats, about building resilience. Quite recently, Jens Stoltenberg stress necessity, although it is predominantly the competence of allies, individual allies, to build resilience of their states vis-a-vis threats and challenges. Yet there is enormous role of NATO as a whole, as an organization, in guiding, in indicating directions. And here I think that experience of Israel is difficult to exaggerate. The situation of pandemics, COVID-19 was just indication of this ability of organizing states' capabilities to cope with disasters like pandemics, but we may face variety of threats in future, and this experience is of utmost experience. Resilience to cyber, to disinformation, information warfare, rightly indicated that the experience of Israel here is of utmost importance. In the report, and most probably in future strategic concept, the whole, I would say, southern flank of NATO and the threats of terrorism are high in the agenda as well. And here I think that contribution of Israel, it's simply difficult to avoid Israel in discussing the issues of this region. When we speak about necessity in very difficult circumstances, when we see challenges all over the world, actually crisis situation all over the world, we have to find synergy among like-minded partners. And in our discussions with representation of Israel, it was just visible that we are like-minded countries, that we perceive challenges, threats in very similar way. Of course, there are differences, regional ones, specificities of individual allies, but it was more than obvious for our interlocutors the necessity to come to closer relationship in the area of security and defense with Israel in variety of formats. So I will conclude.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. It's very heartwarming to hear it. Just as an anecdote on the issue of the pandemic, I'm happy to report that 93% of Israelis over the age of 50 received 2 doses of vaccination. So we are seeing the light in a way. But for minutes,
yeah, maybe one thing, may I add that for the first time, most probably, quite recently, the threats of Iran were mentioned also in the deliberations of experts as necessary to take note about. Within the EU, it is of course subject quite important also because of JCPOA.
Right, definitely, and actually on this issue, similar and touching to this issue, I do want to turn to Ronnie. Ronnie, we are discussing cooperation and regional stability, and you touched a little bit on it, but I would appreciate your analysis and your perspective. How does the historic signing of the Abraham Accords contribute to this stability and also to NATO stability as well?
Yes, thank you for the question, and I appreciate MEP Fotiga friendship to Israel and her contribution to the experts discussion, where I raised the need for NATO to think out of the box and look at the Middle East, at the wider Middle East in a different way now that we have the Abraham Accords. This is an issue that I am discussing both with NATO allies, but also with my regional partners who are interested in greater Israel-Arab-NATO cooperation to deal with regional challenges. And the same challenges that we are facing, NATO is facing. I think that Jamie beautifully characterized it when he spoke about the Mediterranean dialogue grouping. But also my colleague Colonel Omer reminded us that NATO is present in Iraq and Afghanistan and has to deal with challenges in the two countries. NATO is, by the way, being attacked. NATO missions are being attacked by rogue states that are also an issue for for Israel, and also an issue for other NATO partners, specifically the ICI partners. But I guess that the same issue is troubling also other neighbors of Israel. Egypt is one good example. And I think we can find common language and common platforms to discuss those issues. And NATO stands in an excellent place to provide that platform for us. And it's not, again, it's not only about military/defense experience and cooperation. There are semi-military, semi-civilian issues, legal issues that are an issue for Israel, but NATO is already facing and will increasingly face in the future, because the challenge of our militaries today is no longer, or not anymore, only standing militaries, but a different kind of battlefield, which includes both military, semi-military fighters and civilians. So here Israel is bringing unique experience to the table. I dealt for 12 years with Israeli issues at the UN, and we found out that the same challenges that we are facing are being faced by many NATO allies. So that was the trigger to start the discussion with our NATO colleagues. But again, the hesitations which existed 5-10 years ago, bringing together Israelis and Arabs, are no longer relevant, no longer valid. So NATO, I think, can be more daring in bringing together Israelis and Arabs to discuss those issues. We are, by the way, already doing it bilaterally with our Arab partners, both in the region and even here in Brussels. I have great discussions with my Arab colleagues here, who are less hesitant to speak to me than some others, perhaps. So I would encourage NATO to do more in that context.
Thank you. We are about to reach the end of our time, and I do have a final question, but maybe someone from our audience, from our invited audience, because this is a closed group of invitees, maybe you have another question. If so, then please speak now. If not, I'll ask the last question. Okay, so my final question is for all three gentlemen. It is obviously in Israel's interest to contribute to Europe's security. While major progress was achieved, there's always more that can be done. I want to ask you what additional opportunities should be explored between NATO and Israel, and please limit your answer to 1 minute. I'll start with Jamie.
Okay, here we go, 1 minute. Well, I think the first thing is when NATO—
It's military time. I'm putting my timer.
Oh God! No, start me now. Well, I think when NATO looks at its strategic concepts, I think the challenge is going to be that there will be a group of allies that will be looked to Russia, and there will be a group of allies that obviously will be looking to the Asia Pacific and China. You've just seen the recent UK new integrated security review coming out, and I think the danger is that this enormous sort of chunk of real immediate threats that we are facing from the South and the Middle East will somehow get lost between the two behemoths of Russia, very important, and China. So I think the first challenge, and I think Israel's got to help, is to keep NATO focused first and foremost on immediate threats in the neighborhood, which is where we come together. We can't have that important third piece of the jigsaw puzzle sort of falling away as it's all about just Russia and China and the two big authoritarians. So the ambassador mentioned the sub-state actors, the rogue states. If Europe's going to be attacked tomorrow, that's where it's going to come from. So that's the first point. The second point, of course, is that as Russia and China are more important in your area, you know, the Russians have picked up a lot of battlefield experience in Libya, a lot more in Syria. And as China also throws its networks across your region. We also need to hear from you a little bit on that. So we need Israel to take not just a regional perspective, but please take a global perspective. We know you have it, so share that with us as well. Thirdly, I think the ambassador said, you know, we sometimes go slowly at NATO in the more formal meetings, and even though there's no excuse for not being bold, I agree with the ambassador. So let's create as many informal networks as we possibly can, so that the dialogue can flow and not be halted in any way. I know that Israel is ready for that, and the allies have got to be ready for those flexible formats as well. As I said, in the past we've done well. We could have done better. In the future, we cannot afford not to do optimally.
Thank you, Jamie. Nir, I'm turning it to you now. The same question.
Perfect. So I think I'll mention two key issues that I think are extremely relevant. The first one is everything which is related to developing new capabilities. I think you mentioned PESCO earlier in the discussion, and when you look on the European defense projects, Israel has a lot to bring to the table, and I think there are certainly many projects which could lead to a very constructive cooperation and lead to shared intellectual property that can contribute to Europe as well as to Israel, and Israel as a high-tech nation has a lot to bring to the table. The second point, I think in the recent years, we've started training and exercising with international partners much more than before. I can only mention training and exercises that were held with Italy, Cyprus, Greece, Germany, the Netherlands. I could also mention Blue Flag, which is an international air exercise with the 5th-gen aircrafts. So I think these two areas are exceptionally beneficial for Europe as well as to Israel, and there are many others. Thank you.
Thank you, Nir. Ronnie, the floor is yours.
Yes, listening to Jamie, I remember why we miss him so much. So I will add to the list of Nir the following items without elaborating. We recently offered NATO to have established a PTEC in Israel on military medicine, field hospitals, etc. We think that we have a value to add here to NATO. So this is one issue. Another issue is just again headlines: emergency situations and resilience. Unfortunately, we are very good at such situations. Then missile defense, of course, something that we share with many allies bilaterally, and also in the different NATO working groups. Cyber intelligence exchange, counterterrorism, hybrid warfare, all those are issues that we are already doing a lot with, and drones, by the way, drones. We're already doing a lot with NATO, and we'll continue to do more in the next year or two. So those are the issues, but in the form of headlines. Thank you.
Obviously, each headline could be elaborated into another 20 minutes at least.
Right.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your openness and for your willingness and to discuss and really based on your experience and insights. Ronnie Leshno-Yaar, the ambassador of Israel to EU and NATO, Colonel Nir Omer, the military representative to NATO, and Dr. Jamie Shea, the senior fellow at Friends of Europe and NATO's former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. That's a very long title. Thank you again, and I want to return for the closing to my colleague, Daniel Schwemmenthal.
Thank you, Avital. Since we're already a little bit over time, I'm going to keep it very, very short. Big thank you to all our fantastic speakers. Really, really interesting. I learned a lot. Thank you all to our invited guests for your interest. And we hope to see many of you as part of our growing Transatlantic Friends of Israel network. and we will certainly invite you soon to our next exclusive meeting. And I wish you all a great day and stay safe.